Hello, everyone, and welcome to Episode 9 of America and the Signs of the Times. Today we're going to talk about the United States of America not as patriots or critics, but as the people of God who are focused on Him and what He's doing in our world today. The Bible makes it clear that our citizenship is in heaven, so we will try to look with a clear eye at the events that are soon to take place in America and the rest of the world. We're going to ask the question, is America mentioned in the book of Revelation? And the answer is no, and yes. There have been many empires throughout time, but that's not how it all began. The world started with just two people, Adam and Eve. We don't know how long they lived in Eden, but at some point, they made the decision that their opinions in view of their lives and their futures carried as much weight as God's. So they took what He gave them and added to it. They decided that it would be valuable to have the knowledge of good and evil, something that God, in order to protect them, forbade them from knowing. You could say that they stole it. It wasn't theirs to begin with, and they were told not to take it. They probably didn't realize what would come next, but that act separated them from God, and the result was their expulsion from Eden and God's presence. Can we understand or explain what motivated Adam and Eve? Yes. It was the urge of man to make his own decisions in directing his life. God always planned and wanted to be the one giving direction, and now they assumed a responsibility that in reality was only God's. In a sense, they made themselves like God. The separation from God's presence was absolute, but that didn't mean that the knowledge of Him and His laws were gone too. They had experienced God and seen His power and majesty. I wonder if, after being ejected from Eden, they lived in repentance and with the desire to please and honor God. Of course, the Bible is silent on the rest of their lives, but I assume that they had a relationship with the Creator whom they had known personally, and we know that God desired that relationship too. We see that they taught their sons to honor God, and in Genesis 4, both Cain and Abel offer sacrifices in honor of God. There are two sides to the Bible story, and we're familiar with both. First, we see God's dealings with sinful mankind. Second, we see man's attempts to build a life that he was comfortable with. Man had a lot going for him in this respect. God made him the Lord over the creation, but now Adam and Eve were on their own. They weren't clueless as how to live, because God had already instructed them and given them intelligence and strong, healthy bodies. He gifted man with knowledge about how to cultivate the land, make tools, clothing, and shelter. Everything man needed to live, God gave to him in abundance. This shows the love that God has, even for sinful, rebellious man. The descendants of Cain, the one who killed his brother, included Jabal, who was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. He had a brother named Jubal, who was the father of all who play the harp and flute. From him we get the word jubilation. They had another brother named Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. These men, who evidently were the first practitioners of these skills that were so beneficial to mankind, came from the world's first murderer. But in every case, the sin of Adam, inserting his own wishes and using God's gifts to fulfill his own plans, dreams, and desires, redirected the grace of God to accomplish His idea of what his life should be. Of course, man wasn't totally reprobate. In Ecclesiastes, it says that God has put eternity in the heart of man, and that part of the story is just as important as the rebellion against God. In fact, that seed of eternity in man's heart was something God could work with. And so we see a continual conflict in man between trying to please either God or himself. Here's the sad news. It wasn't working. More and more, as the creation experience faded from man's memory, the focus of his life became how he could change everything around him to his own liking. And for them, just like for us, when our focus is on our own lives, not on God, things tend to get worse. Cain murders his brother because he was jealous of him. One of his descendants, Lamech, got into a fight with a young man who wounded him, and Lamech killed him. The result of separating himself from God meant that man was left to his own devices. He would create the world that he wanted, and that reminds me of verses out of the book of Judges where it says, "There was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes." What was right for one man, family, or tribe was never right for the man, family, or tribe that lived next to them, and the result, before the flood, was war and conflict that became widespread. The question is asked in the book of James, chapter 4, 1 through 4, where do wars and conflicts come from? Don't they come from the desires that you have? Things didn't get any better, and although Genesis doesn't detail the sin and destruction that began to grow and then flourish in God's perfect creation, things spiral downward until God decides to kill everyone on earth except for Noah and his family. God saw that every thought and action of man was continually inclined toward evil. It even says that the earth had become corrupt because all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. It's easy for us to condemn the pre-flood world. Those people were evil, violent, and wicked. But Jesus added something else to that picture. He says in Matthew 24, verses 37, 38, and 39, people were eating, drinking, and marrying right before the flood and had no idea of what was about to happen. That's interesting. We see that world as an obviously bad place that deserved its judgment, but Jesus paints a different picture that looks more like our world of today. It seems like a contradiction to me to see on one hand a world that was driven by the evil desires of people to cheat in business, steal from merchants and each other, hide their wrongful acts with lying, commit adultery and murder, or use their power to oppress others, and then, at the same time, in many cases, lead lives that appeared as normal as rain in the springtime. I think that the Lord might be saying to us, don't be comfortable with your opinion of the condition of today's world. It could be worse than you think, and it probably is. So the flood happens, Noah and his family are saved, and begin to repopulate the earth. When we see what his son Ham does in exposing and laughing about his father's drunken nakedness, we realize that in spite of experiencing God's power in destroying the earth and his love and grace in saving Noah's family, man is still separated from God and capable of sinful behavior. As we noted earlier, after Eden, man had two desires which competed to dominate him. The first, to please God and make amends for his sinful behavior. An example of that comes to us in the book of Job. We can assume that Job and his friends weren't Israelites, or else the book would have made that clear. It says that they came from the east. Job and his friends obviously had a relationship with and knowledge of God. And the book tells the story of God's dealing with Job, and for this he uses the devil, and of Job receiving a newer and deeper revelation of the nature of God. So God continued to communicate with man, and there were people who responded to that as best they could. The second desire of man was to create a life and society of his own making, without God, that would give him security, prosperity, and success at whatever the cost. It says that the whole earth had one language and one speech. It says one language, but what does it mean by one speech? As a missionary in Germany for 12 years, I might be able to shed some light on that. In school, every German learns what is called High German. This is German spoken with a universal accent that every German can understand. That's necessary because different areas of the country have different accents or dialects, what could be called speech. They all have special words for describing some things and have ways of pronouncing the German language that isn't the same as the other areas. That literally means a man from Berlin, 362 miles away from Munich, won't be able to understand the Bavarian dialect or speech of his friend who comes from there. He's speaking a version of German that non-Bavarians won't understand. The common language and speech of man gave him the necessary unity to accomplish his goals. We're told in Genesis chapter 11 that man decided to build himself a city, what we would today call a capital, and a tower, to, quote, make a name for ourselves so that we won't be scattered over the face of the whole earth. In other words, to preserve man's unity. So do you see it? Man has set out to create his own world and is using his skills to build a country that will give him power, unity, prosperity, honor, and glory, and all without God. This reflects an important part of what this podcast is all about. Now we can put our finger on the beginning of man's organized efforts to build what would finally result in the creation of the country described in Revelation called Babylon the Great. God disrupted the Tower of Babel, but man never gave up his goal. All his efforts since that time, though not driven by a single ruler with an army and riches, have contributed, century by century, family by family, tribe by tribe, city, country, or empire through the centuries to create man's utopia. As Revelation shows us, he succeeds. The Tower of Babel and Babylon the Great are branches of the same root, the desire of man to be his own God. In the following generations and centuries, man's motivation stayed the same. What changed was technology. Whether it was farming or hunting for food or fighting wars, man continually looked for easier and more efficient ways of doing things. What I'm sharing next is only a brief sketch of the development of man's empires, and the purpose is to bring us to the book of Revelation. I love the study of history, but not everyone does, so I'll try to stay out of the weeds. Now, each of the different groups of Babel had to fend for themselves and begin to build unity in order to assure their own security and prosperity. As the groups competed with each other for food and land, they grew in size and power until you had the makings of countries, then empires. The first real empire is thought to be the Akkadian Empire from around the year 2279 BC, which stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Its political and military organization served as examples for later empires like the Babylonians and the Assyrians, who followed. In China, there was the Qing dynasty, and other empires in India, and in the Americas, the Aztecs and the Mayans, which all started much later. With each of these empires, man steadily added to his experience of how to organize a safe and productive society. New methods were explored, rules and laws were created, and what was essential for all of them, a religion of some sort was created so that a god was brought into the picture to help the rulers move their people in the right direction. In addition to that, there were always men to interpret and pass on the directives of their god and demand obedience. Remember what I said about the root which supported the Tower of Babel and Babylon the Great? It was that same root which propelled those empires down through the ages to securely establish man as the god of his world. Mankind is nothing if not resourceful. History has shown that he's willing to use whatever means he can to improve his lot. He uses God's creation not to honor God, but to make his life better. While not obeying God, he understands the seasons that God has created, and he makes use of those to feed himself with the plants and the animals that God has made. Man uses the mind and strength that God has given him. At the same time, he's following the lead of the devil by using lies, jealousy, and murder to get what he wants. He does these things on an individual level, as well as on a national or worldwide level, and we need to realize we're not just talking about the past, but also about today. And to top it all off, man looks at himself, just like King Nebuchadnezzar did when he was looking at his kingdom, and says, "Look what my hands have accomplished." From the Oscar Awards to the Walk of the Stars in Hollywood, winning the Super Bowl, the World Series, or an Olympic gold medal, creating a successful business, curing diseases, inventing cars and airplanes, being victorious in war, or even having a successful family, man stands back with his hands on his hips, admires the results, and says, "My, look what I've done." He feels he has earned all the glory. As time marches on, the rulers of countries and empires seek to become richer and stronger. This usually happens at the expense of their citizens, who have to pay taxes and fight in their armies. As agricultural practices, medical science, and technologies improve, the populations of countries grow, and with increasing prosperity, the citizens of countries ruled by kings begin demanding to have more of a say in how their countries and their lives are governed. First in Scandinavia, and I'll bet you didn't know that, then in England, Scotland, and France, new ideas of a government that is created by the people, where their own elected representatives, not a king, make laws, are discussed. It's all theory until one day in July of 1776, a revolution is sparked that will result in exactly that form of government. It all happened in a very extraordinary place, in a manner that can never again be repeated in the world. About 280 years before that revolution, Europeans discovered a land, an entire continent that they never knew existed. As the scope of their discovery sank in, the understanding of what it meant opened their minds to new ways of living their lives and building countries. The first settlers to that new continent, now called America, came from England, where many of the new ideas of government had been born. Starting with the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims established government for the Plymouth colony that would be representative in nature. Instead of relying on the King of England for direction, they wrote their own laws and committed themselves to obey them. This was huge. For the first time, citizens were thinking for themselves instead of having laws imposed on them from a faraway monarch. The next thing was just as important. They were living in a strange land that was totally unlike the homes they left. Their neighbors were the original inhabitants, Indians, who were just as likely to start a fight as to be friendly. The forests were unforgiving, and farms were created only after enormous effort to clear the land and plant and harvest the crops. In a word, life in this new, unknown, and untouched land was a challenge, an enormous challenge. Of the first pilgrims who landed with the Mayflower in 1620, half died in the first winter. These settlers in this new land began to develop a whole new way of looking at their lives. For the first time, they had the freedom to decide their own fate, up to a point. There was a real sense that God had brought them there, and they were free to develop the gifts that God had given them, and that an entire continent lay before them. So what you had was a motivated, intelligent, and hard-working people not afraid of hardship and always looking for a better way of doing things. They knew that a type of security and prosperity were possible for them that they never could have had in the countries they had left. I'm not going to go into the history of the United States, but we know the stories of the settlers always pushing westwards. America had a frontier for about 280 years, up until about 1890, and the trials, sacrifice, and success it brought formed a people the world had never before seen. In the early 1800s, Europeans coined the phrase, the American method. It described America's energy to always look for a faster, more efficient way to solve the problems of life in an untouched continent. Bobby Jindal, a former governor of Louisiana whose parents came from India, said that his father once told him, "Americans can do anything." By 1890, the American economy passed that of Great Britain, becoming the largest in the world, a position it still holds. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, the U.S. was recognized as a major world power and became what was called a superpower at the end of World War II. When the Soviet Union fell, America remained as the world's only superpower. Now we're going to switch gears. I just described the founding of America and its ascent to a world power, and now we're going to leap forward a long way to the book of Revelation. Is the United States mentioned in Revelation? No, and yes. Revelation tells us about a city in the end times called Babylon the Great, and you might recognize it. How is it described? Let's look at what it says. The most obvious thing we see is her riches. From Revelation chapter 18 we read, "O great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth." And, "Was there ever a city like this great city?" These two verses tell us a lot. In the eyes of the world at that time, and John was looking far into the future, she is called the greatest city the world has ever seen. We can assume that the people making these claims were aware of history, so that they could say those things. It also says, "where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth." Babylon was an enormous consumer of the world's goods to the point that the entire world sold their wares to her and became rich also. Those verses also indicate that most of those things arrived at her shores in ocean-going ships. And I want to throw something in here to give us context. John was writing in Revelation about the end times, and there's no argument that today we are much closer than he was 2,000 years ago. So today, is it possible for all the world's merchants to be able to trade with one nation, and that the majority of the trade is done by ship? Of course it is. Babylon isn't their only customer, but she's their biggest customer. With the development of countries and empires, like we looked at earlier, we have seen empires grow larger and more powerful as time went on. Is it impossible to believe that one country could more or less rule the rest of the world's nations? Revelation talks of Babylon as being a city, but I'm going to take the liberty to call it a country, which I think is correct. It's possible that it's called a city because that is where the power and spirit of Babylon is based. We see in Revelation 2:13 that Satan has his throne in the city of Pergamum. So it's not unreasonable to think that the spirit of Babylon is also located in one city and rules a country from there. I wonder what city that could be. Chapter 18 of Revelation goes on, O great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stone, and pearls. There's no mistaking what this means. It is an enormously wealthy city, more than any other city, so that the observers here make a point of talking about her riches and greatness. Is there a country today which, when compared to the rest of the world in all of history, is enormously wealthy? Now, it doesn't mention this, but two things are very important for great wealth to be accumulated in this world. The first is peace. Peace allows investments to be made in safety, and people are allowed to keep the fruits of their labors. Wars, especially modern wars, cost a lot of money, cause a lot of destruction, and don't lead to prosperity. There was one exception to that. The U.S. in World War II was called the Arsenal of Democracy, and its factories supplied the Allied armies with amazing amounts of weaponry and everything else they needed. America was able to do that because of its enormous size and productivity. Remember the American method? And there was no fighting or destruction of cities here, like in Europe and Asia. The other thing which contributes to great wealth is freedom. The socialist countries of our world don't hold a candle to the freedom Americans have to earn and keep what they work for. Those countries manage their economies from the top, rather than giving people the freedom to compete, grow, and innovate on their own. Then, they tax their people heavily with the goal of caring for them like a parent and to give money to others. By way of comparison between the freest economy of the world and its closest rival, we have the U.S. average income as being 6 to 7 times higher than that of the average Chinese income. So an assumption I make about Babylon the Great is that not only has she become rich, but at least for an important portion of her existence, she has given her citizens the freedom to prosper however they chose. You know, just like we do here in the U.S. Babylon's peace and prosperity don't come about because the world has a warm, fuzzy feeling toward her. In Revelation chapter 18, verse 7, Babylon says, I sit as queen. I'm not a widow, and I will never mourn. And in chapter 17, verse 18, it says, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Again, we're talking about the end times. In the days of Kings David and Solomon, when the world was talked about, it actually meant the world from India to the Mediterranean Sea, because that was the entire world that they knew. In the end times, it literally means all the earth. She is not only the richest and most powerful militarily, but she rules the other nations, and her intent is to preserve her greatness. She says, I will never mourn, meaning she thinks that she will never lose what she has. This shows us that the city or nation is self-deceived and has no idea or clue that it is about to be destroyed. To help you understand the mindset of Babylon, or the end-time country that Revelation is talking about, read Victor Davis Hanson's book, The End of Everything. It brings to light the thoughts and accepted wisdom of great empires shortly before they disappeared from history. These were powerful nations like Rome, the Greek states, the Aztecs, and others that had the world's respect both back then and today. They were confident in their greatness and power and had a long and proud history to reassure them that things would never change. They all faced a dangerous threat that they didn't completely understand, and to everyone's shock and amazement, they were destroyed. Since the Apostle John was writing 2,000 years ago about events in the future that had already taken place, the Babylon we are looking at will be destroyed. Now the spiritual dimension is added to the story of Babylon the Great, and I'm going to get into greater detail about that in my next podcast. But let's look at Revelation chapter 17, verse 16, where it identifies her enemies and what they do to her. Quote, the beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Then, in 18 verse 10, it says, terrified at her torment, they, the ship captains and owners, will stand far off and cry, "Woe, woe, O great city, O Babylon, city of power! In 1 hour your doom has come." Verses 15, 16, and 17 say, "They will weep and mourn and cry out, 'In 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin.'" The destruction of Babylon is unexpected, shocking, and complete. When we read the descriptions of Babylon, we have to admit that there are many parallels to one country in all of history and in the world today, America. Babylon was called the richest country the world had ever seen. Of course, our ability to look into the future is limited, but I want to suggest something for you to think about. As I shared earlier, the beginnings and development of the United States were extraordinary. The rest of the world, Europe, Asia, and Africa, had already been settled and divided into tribes and countries. This was true also of North and South America, but the native populations were greatly decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles, so that as the settlers pushed westward across the continent, there were no large tribes to slow them down or stop them. You had an entire resource-rich continent available to people who were able and willing to use it to build the richest, most prosperous country the world had ever seen. For all the things I cited about the growth and prosperity that made America, I don't believe that any country in the world will be able to match the United States. No country is as free or motivated or has a continent as rich as North America. Every other nation is bound by ancient traditions, customs, and borders that still define and limit them. No country will ever be able to duplicate what America has accomplished. In respect of the wealthiest country that we see today, only America is a perfect fit to Babylon. Revelation 17 verse 15 says that this country is comprised of peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. This also fits America. No other country is as open to the world as the U.S. People from everywhere in the world have come to live here and call themselves Americans. This is not true of any other country, and is another piece where America fits in the Revelation puzzle. It mentions languages. God confused the language of the people building the Tower of Babel, because with unity of language, they couldn't be stopped. The world of today again has one language, and that is English. The main reason for that is the worldwide spread of American business and culture. Babylon rules the nations and says, "I am queen." Notice that she doesn't say she is a queen. She isn't sharing her power with anyone. She is the queen. As such, she has influence over military and economic power and culture. This fits the America of today. Here I have to mention that the vision of President Trump to make America great again. To that purpose, he is using the military to enforce peace in the world. Remember that peace is an important element of prosperity, and Trump knows it. He's also using the economic power of America to force other countries to follow his trade policies. They have no choice but to get in line. President Trump isn't trying to, and I'm sure he's not even aware of it, but he is adding the final touches to Babylon the Great. And now, on a more sobering note, we read that Babylon's doom was sealed in 1 hour, and that her enemies will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Christians reading this passage for the last 2,000 years must have scratched their heads and wondered how this could happen. Today, we don't wonder, and the answer could certainly be atomic weapons. Every war in history has seen the use of every available weapon of that age, from the crossbow to gunpowder, to poisonous gas and the atomic bomb. The destruction described here won't be the result of just one nuclear bomb. Babylon, the U.S., will be destroyed by perhaps hundreds of nuclear bombs, each one 80 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Once more we see America exists at a time in history that best seems to fit the puzzle of this part of Revelation. All this is hard to believe about the freest and indeed the most Christian country the world has ever seen. America has been generous with its success and has even liberated millions of people from tyrants. Without doubt, the world has been blessed by the country which began 250 years ago. So how could America be the Babylon mentioned in Revelation? Well, for all the reasons I cited above, and for what I'm going to share next week. Don't miss it. It'll answer a lot of your questions. In closing, I want to remind you what Jesus said with the beginning of birth pains, which I think is where we are now. These things must happen. He goes on to show us how to prepare, and I covered a lot of what he said in episode 8 of this podcast. Here's an additional important tip. As a young Christian, I lived on a Christian discipleship commune, which was part of a larger group. We lived together, worked together, ate together, loved each other, learned with each other, and grew in the knowledge and grace of the Lord. That experience taught us that our brothers and sisters in Christ were a very important part of learning about God and being able to stand against the attacks of the enemy. We also learned that God didn't call us to be lone rangers, but to work with other Christians. That's how God made it to be, and it's something that honestly, the American church doesn't do nearly enough. So it's important that you make an effort to spend time with other Christians. Learn to love them as brethren and share your life with them as they share theirs with you. Hard times are coming, and we will need each other like never before. Thank you for listening. Please share about this podcast with others. It is important that we be prepared. Pray about these things and let the Holy Spirit speak to you. He is your teacher, guide, and comforter, and will always be with you. God bless you, and we'll meet you again next week.